Hey folks, and welcome to our video on Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure and narrative cinema and Jacques Lacan. Alternatively, we could call this video Laura Mulvey's visual pleasure and narrative cinema and psychoanalysis. So primarily the goal of this video is to spend a little bit more time with a little bit more nuance on the psychoanalytic foundations of Laura Mulvey's famous essay. It's the essay that made the phrase male gaze popular. And the first section of the essay is called A Political Use of Psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a set of theories and techniques that deal with the unconscious mind. It's not the same thing as psychology. We can think of psychoanalysis as it's adapted by Mulvey to be concerned with two major thinkers, Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan. In my previous videos on this essay, I've spent a little bit more time with Sigmund Freud, a little bit less with Jacques Lacan. So the goal of this video is to flesh out some of the Lacanian principles of Mulvey's essay. Let's keep in mind that Laura Mulvey's interest in these two thinkers is part of a larger field of intellectual inquiry called psychoanalytic feminism. It's a set of theories that adopt psychoanalytic principles, especially those concerning gender, in order to analyze and diagnose the psychical conditions of patriarchy. Laura Mulvey begins her essay in her third paragraph by saying there is an obvious interest in psychoanalysis for feminists, a beauty in its exact rendering of the frustration experienced under the phallocentric order. It gets us nearer to the roots of our oppression. Those of you who are familiar with Sigmund Freud might be surprised that there is such a thing called psychoanalytic feminism that adopts Freud's ideas in order to diagnose the oppression of women in a patriarchal world. That might seem surprising because Freud's ideas have been called misogynist themselves. So I want to clarify momentarily some of the intellectual strategies that psychoanalytic feminists use to make clear their adoption of Freud and other psychoanalyst thinkers in order to carry out a feminist goal. So Juliet Mitchell wrote an influential book called Psychoanalysis and Feminism in 1975. Juliet Mitchell is a psychoanalyst and a feminist, and she tried to clarify the meeting point between these two philosophies in her book in a pretty useful way. So I'm going to kind of summarize those very two simple principles. Number one, she said that Freud's seemingly patriarchal views aren't prescriptive, but descriptive. If you have a cursory understanding of Freud, you might point out concepts like penis envy. That idea on the surface seems inherently misogynistic because it says that one kind of people, men, have something and have more than women do. Mitchell comes along though and says, we don't need to take this as Freud's prescription for how the world should be. And after all, Freud never said this is how he wanted the world to be. He was trying to describe the world that he was born into and come up with a series of theories for explaining how that world was. The second principle that's useful for us is that Juliet Mitchell, already in 1975, was a devotee of Jacques Lacan, who is a French psychoanalyst thinker who is a reader of Freud and integrates Freud into a larger history of philosophy, complicating his ideas by merging them with other thinkers. She makes a second point in order to deflect the antagonism that feminists might have for Freud's ideas. She says Jacques Lacan liberates Freud from his alleged biological or anatomical essentialism. What I mean by that is that a feminist critique of Freud might be that he posits a worldview in which every human being is predetermined by their sexual anatomy. People with penises will just be a certain way, and people without penises will just be a certain way. Mitchell, following a lot of adopters of Lacanian psychoanalysis within feminism, will say that Lacan's reading of Freud doesn't fall prey to the same ideas. It's a rereading of Freud. To spell this out a bit more, Mitchell says, quote, in the Freud that Lacan uses, neither the unconscious nor sexuality are pre-given facts, they are constructions. That is, they are objects with histories. So it's a tendency in certain kinds of feminist thought, though not a rule, that seeing gender as a construction is advantageous. Because if gender is a construction, therefore the patriarchal world in which men are favored and women are not is also a construction that can be changed. Thus, for people like Mitchell, Lacan's rereading of Freud that distances Freud's ideas from anatomical determinism, the idea that we can't really change our situations because you're just born with what you got, that might be particularly attractive for the feminist project. Okay, so that's just a bit of background. What I really want to do in this video is try to explain one single paragraph in Laura Mulvey's essay that constitutes a sort of summary of background material about Freud and Lacan's ideas. It's the second paragraph of the entire essay, which is highlighted here. So let's start here, and then we're going to make our way through the entirety of the paragraph. She begins, "The paradox of phallocentrism in all its manifestations is that it depends on the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world. An idea of woman stands as linchpin to the system. It is her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence." So I'm just going to try to go through and find the jargon that Mulvey herself doesn't explain and try to explain it myself. So the first bit of jargon is the word phallocentrism. Phallocentrism is the idea that the phallus, or male sexual organ, is the central element in the organization of the social world. Again, a sympathetic reading of Freud is to say that he's not prescribing that the world should be phallocentric, but he's describing a world that already is phallocentric. When Mulvey says that the paradox of phallocentrism in all its manifestations is that it depends on the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world, this is what she means. That according to a Freudian worldview, there are two kinds of people. Those who have the phallus, or for Freud, the penis, and those who don't have the phallus, men and women. And we can think of this as a binary. Now, for those of you who have read a lot more Freud, you might object to the idea that Freud even has this binary. And a lot of work has been done to suggest that Freud is a lot less binary of a thinker than we think he is. But Mulvey's reading of Freud in Psychoanalysis is very binary in her essay. And my goal here is to explicate not Freud, but Mulvey's reading of Freud. So once again, in Freud's worldview, according to Mulvey, there are two kinds of people. We can think of that as a binary, which I'm symbolizing by 1 and 0. Those who have it and those who don't. Put differently, those who lack something, women, and those who don't lack something, men. Then Mulvey uses this term, castrated woman. What does she mean by that? The woman is castrated and the man is not castrated. Well, she's referring to this idea of castration anxiety, which lies at the very center of her entire essay. It's a concept from Freud, which says that the male fear of emasculation, that is the loss of power, is founded on the childhood discovery of sexual difference. That girls, or cis girls to use a contemporary parlance, don't have penises. Most of Freud's grand ideas about human subjectivity functions comes from an analysis of childhood development and childhood experience. He says that the reason that we are the way we are can be largely attributed to repressed memories of experiences we had when we were very little, when we were babies and infants and young children. One of those core experiences is called the discovery of sexual difference. When, say, a little boy who knows he has a penis discovers for the first time that, say, his mother doesn't have a penis, he thus assumes in some way that his mother must have lost her penis through some traumatic incident, and then forever has anxiety that he too might lose his penis. Think of this as a kind of cultural myth that Freud invents in order to explain a general principle that men are afraid of losing the power that they have in society. Mulvey continues, "It is her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence. It is her desire to make good the lack that the phallus signifies." So here I want to dwell for a moment on this word phallus. The word phallus for Freud means penis, the male sex organ, but especially what the penis comes to symbolize culturally in the world in which Freud and we live. But when Mulvey uses the word phallus, she's simultaneously invoking Freud's use of the word phallus and Jacques Lacan's use of the word phallus, which is fairly different from Freud's. When Lacan says phallus, he doesn't literally refer to the male sex organ. He's using the word phallus to mean a signifier of lack and sexual difference more generally. So here's what I mean. Lacan was less interested in literally pointing to the male sex organ and saying that this is the reason that we live in a society that says men have this and women don't have this. He more so wanted to say that we live in a society in which men are perceived and experiencing the world as having something, and women are perceived and experiencing the world as not having something. Let's call that something the phallus. In a similar way, the phallus is also a signifier of lack more generally. So both Freud and Lacan talk a lot about something that happens to babies when they grow up. When you're a baby and you're held in your mother's arms and you're drinking breast milk and you cry and immediately get attention and you're always attached to your mom and you're always feeling great, that is a state of perfect equilibrium. But all babies experience a traumatic loss when suddenly mom's not there when you need her. So remember how we talked about the gender binary as 1 and 0? That men are 1 and women are 0 because they lack the penis? Lacan is going to want to see that 1 and 0 in different kinds of relations. As soon as the baby experiences the fact that mom leaves, that mom isn't always there when the baby wants mom, it becomes a 0. It becomes a lack. And this is true of boy babies and girl babies. The baby thinks, what does dad have that I don't? Lacan's answer? The phallus. The baby notices that when mom is gone, she spends time with dad. And the baby thinks, what does dad have that I don't? Lacan's answer? What dad has is the phallus. The baby is forever a zero looking to become a one. The baby is forever lacking something and looking to fill that hole. That looking for is what Lacan calls desire. Desire, by its very nature, is the lack of something. If you want something, you don't have it. So when Mulvey says it is her lack that produces the phallus as a symbolic presence, she is indeed invoking Lacan's idea. The phallus is not necessarily the actual male sex organ. It's a symbolic presence. It's the very notion of having something, of being in a world in which some people have it and some people don't. Mulvey continues, recent writing and screen about psychoanalysis in the cinema has not sufficiently brought out the importance of the representation of the female form in a symbolic order in which, in the last resort, it speaks castration and nothing else. So Screen is the name of the journal in which Mulvey's essay appears. It's also a name of a journal in which lots of psychoanalytic film theory had been written. Mulvey is not the first person to use Lacan's ideas in talking about film as a medium, but she is one of the first and one of the most famous to link those ideas of Lacan and Freud and film to psychoanalytic definitions of gender difference, sexual difference. And when she says representation of the female form, what she means is that, hey, if Freud and Lacan have this worldview in which we have men and women, men who got it, women who don't, why don't we think about the image of woman? And the fact that we live in a world in which there are particular codes to how women are represented in films and in advertising and on television. Why don't we think about images of women as also signifying lack, and by extension, castration? That's what she means here by representation of the female form. She means pictures. Why don't we think about our visually saturated world through these theories? And then she says this, to summarize briefly, the function of woman in forming the patriarchal unconscious is twofold. She first symbolizes the castration threat by her real absence of a penis, and second, thereby raises her child into the symbolic. When she says woman symbolizes the castration threat by her real absence of a penis, this is what she means. Because women don't have a penis, they thereby symbolize the threat of castration. Seeing a woman's body for the first time in Freud's theory of castration anxiety is the thing that triggers castration anxiety for the boy child. Mulvey says that by extension, images of women also trigger castration anxiety for adult men, even if they don't realize it. But what's the second thing? She says first the woman symbolizes the castration threat and thus raises her child into the symbolic. She further explains, woman turns her child into the signifier of her own desire to possess a penis, the condition she imagines of entry into the symbolic. What could Mulvey possibly mean by woman turning her child into the signifier of her own desire to possess a penis? Well, this is actually a foundational idea in Freud and Lacan. Because woman is defined as lacking something, that is, without phallus, she's looking for plenitude after discovering that she, because of her body, is defined by not having something. Freud says that the only way that she can feel plenitude, feel full, feel as if she has that thing that she lacks, is by having a baby. Freud even at times refers to this as a penis baby. In an article on psychoanalytic feminism by Emily Zakin, she provides an account of this idea. She says, in the girl's Oedipal scenario, the father, unlike the castrated mother, stands for the virile capacity for desire itself, which she herself lacks, but might reclaim through another man's provision of the opportunity to have a child. So on the face of it, this whole idea might sound absurd. In what way does a baby resemble a penis? But if we use the idea that phallus doesn't literally mean penis, but represents the capacity for agency, the capacity for controlling your own pleasure, and just the capacity to feel full and complete and without lack, then we might start to see the logic of this claim. Mulvey continues, once this has been achieved, that is having a child, her meaning in the process is at an end. It does not last into the world of law and language except as a memory which oscillates between memory of maternal plenitude and memory of lack. So first, when she says her meaning in the process is at an end, she's trying to emphasize the very limited options that women have within this worldview. A woman can either exist as lack, or she can temporarily mitigate that sense of lack by having a child. But of course, having a child always results in the child growing up and detaching itself from the mom. So that feeling of fullness is tragically temporary. And this is kind of why Mulvey says it does not last into the world of law and language, the world of adulthood. the world that we live in once we've moved beyond infancy. A woman can only remember her maternal plenitude, the feeling of being full, of having that one rather than being a zero. But she can never sustain that plenitude because the child always grows up. But for a moment, I want to explicate this idea of world of law and language, because she's referring to an important idea here in Lacan's writing. And that idea is called the symbolic. You might have noticed that in this second paragraph, Mulvey uses this word a lot, symbolic, in phrases like symbolic order, raises her child into the symbolic, or entry into the symbolic. She's borrowing this idea from Lacan. Lacan famously names 3 registers of experience: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary concerns the register of experience that deals in images and imagination. The symbolic concerns the register of experience that deals in signs, language, law, and codes. The real concerns that which cannot be explained or contained by language or codes. And I'm not going to talk about the real here because it's just going to confuse things. I only want to talk about the symbolic and the imaginary. You can think of the symbolic as the grown-up world of culture, of a world where we exteriorize our feelings and emotions with language, of a world that has laws that preclude certain actions and desires, of a world that has social codes in which when I talk to someone, I already curtail the ways that I can speak by virtue of manners. I don't talk to my boss the same way that I talk to my mom. So when Mulvey says this, either the woman must gracefully give way to the word, the name of the father and the law, she's talking about the symbolic realm, the symbolic order. And she's trying to emphasize that once we grow up from babies to infants to adults who use language and who exist in society, the options for female plenitude are severely limited. And it's also important to note that while the imaginary and the symbolic are registers of experience that inform our daily life, even as adults, they also have an important role in the story that Lacan wants to tell about how we get from babies to infants to adults. So you can think of childhood development for Lacan as going from a pre-imaginary stage to an imaginary stage to a symbolic stage. In the pre-imaginary and pre-symbolic stage, the child is attached to the mother. It sees no distinction between itself and its mother. It has no sense of sexual difference. It is just a being who's always feeling great because as soon as it has a need, that need is met by its mother. It feels attached to the mom. It doesn't even differentiate itself as a being from the mom. Then the imaginary stage happens. This is the moment that the child realizes that they are distinct from the mother. The story that Lacan tells for this is called the mirror stage. When the child looks at the mirror for the first time and recognizes itself as a whole being, it no longer thinks of itself as a combined being with its mom, but as a separate, unified self. And it gets a sense of itself from that image. Even though for Lacan that image is a false representation, this starts a process whereby the child, and eventually even adults, will always try to feel like a whole and complete self by looking at images in the world. Images of ourselves in the mirror, images of ourselves that we might craft, but also images of other people that we want to identify with. Think of social media and celebrities, and even films. The symbolic is the stage that occurs after the imaginary. It's a social structure defined through difference. Once that child discovers that there is such a thing called sexual difference, that the child, if it's a boy, has a penis and its mom doesn't, everything forever changes. If it's a boy, the child will fear castration. Symbolically, it'll fear the loss of its power. If it's a girl, the girl will always feel as if it is defined by lack and search for plenitude. Once we are conscious of this fundamental sexual difference in sex, and conscious of the fact that we are isolated selves from the world, that's the symbolic order. And Mulvey says that once we get there, women are screwed. So to explain that passage more clearly, when Mulvey says either the woman must gracefully give way to the word, the name of the father and the law, or else struggle to keep her child down with her in the half-light of the imaginary, she's reiterating that idea that a woman has 2 options. Either exist as defined by lack, or have a child and struggle to keep that child in a state of underdevelopment where it's always being attached to the mom. That's what she means by the half-light of the imaginary. Mulvey is trying to reiterate the idea that if having a child is the only way that woman can feel full, that she can find plenitude, then the only way that she could sustain that feeling of plenitude is by stymieing the growth of the child, keeping it down with her in the half-light of the imaginary stage before the child gets to the symbolic. That is, before it develops. And here's how Mulvey ends that whole paragraph. She says, woman's desire is subjugated to her image as bearer of the bleeding wound. She can only exist in relation to castration and cannot transcend it. Woman then stands in patriarchal culture as signifier for the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of woman, still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. So I hope that these final sentences make a little bit more sense after we've been through all the jargon that Mulvey is using, right? Now we have a better sense of what castration means, what symbolic order means, but I also want us to understand one final term, signifier. So in order to understand this, we need to see the way that Mulvey is using the word signifier in a particular way. She's borrowing it from Lacan. And Lacan is borrowing it from this person, Ferdinand de Saussure, the founder of structural linguistics. For Lacan, a signifier is a sign's physical form, such as a sound, printed word, or image, as distinct from its meaning. So if we have this concept of tree, the signifier of tree is literally the sound that you hear when you hear that word coming out of my mouth, or it's the squiggles on a chalkboard that when you read it, you think tree. It's the thing that stands in for the idea or the concept. Lacan will borrow this idea of signifier in his rereading of Freud. And this is how I might expand the notion of signifier to understand what Lacan means by it. The single condition which characterizes something as a signifier for Lacan is that it is inscribed in a system in which it takes on value purely by virtue of its difference from the other elements in the system. This idea that something only means something by virtue of its difference from something else is the essence of structuralism, and by extension, structural linguistics. It makes sense as a theory of language. It's a system in which words take on value purely by virtue of their difference from other words. Lacan is adopting that idea and injecting it into Freudian psychoanalysis. So think of it this way. The idea of woman within a Lacanian worldview takes on value in the system of binary gender relations purely by virtue of her anatomical difference from man. This is why we started the video with this fundamental binary difference, 1 and 0. Without lack, lack. Man, woman. This is what Mulvey is trying to emphasize, that psychoanalysis is a system of meaning that is based on a binary in which there is a positive side of that binary and a negative side of that binary. Woman is negative in the binary. She is the 0, man is the 1. This is how binary structures work. Good and evil is a binary. The idea of evil takes on value in the system of binary relations of, say, morality, purely by virtue of its difference from good. Evil is often understood as a lack of good. We could say the same thing about darkness. The idea of dark takes on value in a system of binary relations purely by virtue of its difference from light. Dark is defined by the lack of light. This kind of thinking seems rather harmless when we're talking about light and dark or good and evil, but it's not harmless when we're talking about an entire group of people. This is what Mulvey is trying to say when she says that woman's desire is subjugated to her image as bearer of the bleeding wound. She can only exist in relation to castration and cannot transcend it. In other words, woman is defined as castrated, as lacking something, and as signifying castration and the anxiety about it to men, and that's all she is. This does not imply that men, because they have the thing, have the penis, are doing just fine. Men also feel empty, and men treat themselves through fantasies and obsessions. That is, through active pursuits. But woman, as Mulvey is trying to make clear, doesn't get to have those active pursuits, those fantasies and obsessions. She is merely a tool used by the man in order to feel full and complete. This is why Mulvey says woman is tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. That is, there would be no system, no binary system without the 0 complementing the 1. That's why woman as 0, in a sense, defines the 1. There's no one without the other. There is no man without woman. There is no phallocentrism without a group of people that lacks the phallus. But the tragedy is that even though women are the linchpin of the system, they only exist negatively. They don't get to make meaning the way that men do. They are the bearer of meaning. Now we can understand one of the fundamental binary oppositions in Mulvey's paper, where she talks about films and the stories that tend to get told. Men are active and women are passive. Men drive the story, and women are used as the objects of men in order to carry that story along. Men look, and women get looked at. And that's it for this deep dive into the second paragraph of Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. I'll see you next time.